My name is Joshi Radin. I am with the Chemical Reactions Project with the Goethe-Institut Chicago. We are closing down the project after not a year, but it's been about 9 months through a pandemic. And we have the opportunity to speak with Berlin-based curator and researcher Caroline Ektander. And I'm thrilled to have Caroline with us. I will just give a brief biography for some context. Caroline, as I mentioned, is Berlin-based curator and writer, and she is currently pursuing a doctoral degree in design at the Bauhaus Weimar. Her research is concerned with the remediation of industrial legacies and how to better account for the stakes that regularly fall outside the Western capitalist paradigm. She is the co-founder of the interdisciplinary platform Toxic Commons and regularly talks and writes about socio-environmental toxicity across the field of art and academia. So Caroline, I maybe just mentioned, where have you been these last couple of days? What is this workshop that you've been involved with?
Yeah, so I am since many years engaged with some other actors sort of grappling or trying to make sense of this notion of toxic commons. And yesterday and today was our first kind of academic endeavor or attempt at making sense of this. So we were a workshop of, we had a lawyer, we had an earth scientist, we had people from art and design, we had history, and kind of convened by my longtime collaborator, Simone Müller. She's an environmental historian in Munich. And yeah, we workshopped and I ran for a train, came here, try to get Instagram going. So I think there's the sort of conversations that I left, I think will probably feed into this conversation too. They resonate.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, there were multiple reasons. You came recommended to me by Sandra Teitke and Franziska Pirvas, and Petra at the Goethe was also very enthusiastic. And when we spoke initially, just to see if this would be a good fit, I was very excited because the Chemical Reactions Project exists in partnership with 3 environmental organizations, 2 which are very grassroots, and then 1 that is more regularly funded. And all 3 of these organizations are dealing with specific assets or aspects of Chicago. And Chicago's history as this lakeside metropole that had a huge amount of steel industry and other forms of manufacture, also the Chicago stockyards, which, the runoff from the stockyards is sort of made famous in The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So one organization is on the southwest side, one organization is on the southeast side, and one is committed to the waterways of the Chicago River that run north and south and east and west. And the way that you were describing in Bitterfeld how it has this tremendous toxic legacy, and I would love for you to give some more background to that. But the fact that the groundwater contamination is still an issue and the soil contamination is still an issue, even though there has been some efforts at beautifying and remediating the outsides of these landscapes. And for example, Bubbly Creek, which it bubbled because of all of the animal waste that was put into this creek. It's called a Superfund site, or it was a Superfund site for many years, which is how the federal government designates sites that will need to be cleaned up that are beyond what the state can do. That's my understanding. It has to be a federal intervention. So there's a plan to remediate it, but it's so toxic on the bottom with old heavy metals and other compound carbon. I'm forgetting all the acronyms, but there are a lot of acronyms. But they want to just create a new bottom, an artificial bottom, by creating putting sand over the top of it, and then planting on top of that. But essentially, it would be like capping, giving it, a new bottom. And then also they have these uh, items of the fish hotels because these rivers were dredged for commercial passage. And so they have lost all of the kind of natural nuances or hiding places or bends so that ships and industry can take place.
Mm.
So the problem was that fish and small animals have nowhere to grow up. They need hiding places in order to get bigger so they don't just get eaten or killed off when they're small. So they started creating these first out of abandoned car parts, like a car skeleton, strip it down and then put it in, and it was called a fish hotel. And it's this way that is not, it's this way of inviting nature back in without even pretending to try and go back to some sort of pristine or natural environment. And I hear echoes of that in what's going on in Bitterfeld. And I could point to other examples of this that are happening in other areas of Chicago. But Chicago as a huge center for steel and other chemical manufacturers and also oil refining. And currently there's a refinery that's in Indiana, just adjacent to Chicago in Gary, where the tar sands from Canada are sent and refined. So I'd love to hear sort of with your more broad experience of looking at toxic dissemination, what is the history of Bitterfeld specifically for a non-German audience? And then also, what are some of the similarities that you tend to see over these post-industrial transformations?
Yeah, this is fantastic to learn also a little bit about Chicago and this fish hotel. I mean, I don't think there have been such great examples or remediation attempts, I would say, in Bitterfeld of the same sort. But it's interesting. The workshop that I just attended was grappling with this notion of toxic commons in a way to sort of accept that we live in a kind of permanently polluted world like the sort of runoff of industrial activity and agriculture, they're going to stay with us. These sort of persistent chemicals don't break down so quickly, and radiation, nuclear waste, like we know they operate in a completely different time span, yet we sort of undertake these cleanup actions that are actually unable to clean up. Like there are no spaces on this earth that are like able to become clean because of the sort of transgressive nature of these materials moving and not behaving contained. Like they move through our commons and they distribute through our commons. So I've and that's what we've been talking very much about this through different examples. And I guess I've landed in Bitterfeld to think this further. I mean I take on different sort of case studies or sort of objects to consider this phenomena of a kind of off metabolic relationship between kind of humans and their environments, and how they tend to go wrong. So to sort of step out and look at Bitterfeld. Bitterfeld is it's a Superfund site. It's one of Germany's 25 Superfund sites, and I think it's also one of the biggest. Bitterfeld, when the wall came down an odd 30 years ago, it was named or became infamous as the dirtiest city in Europe. It had this sort of toxic concentration of a very long industrial history of brown coal extraction, and this sort of like heavy, dirty industry of excavating the whole region or around that city. And then that became sort of the perfect match with chemical industry, because you want to have the industry where where you can burn the coal and go quickly. So Bitterfeld grew along with two other cities close by and became a kind of electrochemical triangle, they call it in Germany. And this boomed in the end of the 19th century. And then with the sort of shifting regimes, I mean, that's something that's very particular about here in Germany. You know, they're moving through like different kind of layers of ideologies, having a, you know, like a Nazi regime in Bitterfeld, and the sort of the how the chemical industry kind of developed with that, to then, you know, that being dismantled and taken apart, and then turned into a Soviet regime and like a socialist, and how it then continued, and the kind of relative precarity of the East to the West, and how the East had to sort of led to an immense amount of polluting by the end of the 80s. They literally took these brown coal pits and poured chemical sludge into them. So speaking of this bioremediation of the water, there's a sea known as the Silbersee, like the Silver Sea, because of the quicksilver layer. It was literally silver. And this sea they have actually left. It's kind of sunk in. And now they started now in kind of the beginning of the year, and they've just now covered it up and will put kind of plants on top of it. And it, you know, respect to kind of cleaning up the sea bottom and like capping it over. At the same time, they have an immense infrastructure in groundwater cleaning, it's like a silhouette of the city, these like kind of tubes moving through. And there was a article at the beginning of the year called Pumpen ohne Ende, like there will be no stop to pumping. You know, this is labor that will continue for at least the next 100 years, if 200-300 years. The water that is taken, like sucked up from, you know, at a considerable depth, is black still.
Oh, wow.
So I mean, and that's what I think we've been talking a lot about, because that's where I'm coming from, a conversation about this, like kind of understanding, seeing, you know, like we're still, Bitterfeld has been kind of cleaned up cosmetically. It looks like a kind of two-dimensional rendition of leisure and nature with a big N. But at the same time, you have this sort of discrepancy and this conflict of this completely dirty water. Like you can't water your plants with the water from there. So, you know, these kind of complex relation and that I think, I know that we talked about it before, about the sort of the ground in the seabed in the Great Lakes. If we start moving it, it's really, there's so much
Yes,
potential
there's
that you release there. So yeah, and so I mean, what I think around, or think is interesting to think around in Bitterfeld, is on the one hand this kind of very complex kind of history, but on the other hand, what I find so interesting there is that the chemical industry is still very alive and thriving. So this kind of well cosmetic, cleaned up view has sort of sanctioned a continuation of that very toxic relation. I mean, the when the wall came down, the chemical industry was nothing that no one wanted to buy it. They couldn't privatize it. It was like a common good, and they were trying desperately to sell it off. And it turned into then that the federal government had to go in, pump an immense amount of money into this cleanup, and then they created a new business model, which is called a chemical park. So it's an infrastructure where global chemical companies can sort of plug into this infrastructure, and that could be that they're either then through kind of techno fixes, you know, or very like high technology taking care of chemical waste, or that simply chemical production is still externalized somewhere else. So, you know, the you know, have they kind of dealt with the legacy, or, you know, how, at what depth do you kind of deal with that, the kind of material legacy of such a history? No.
It's fascinating. And it also makes me think of a current struggle that's happening in these same areas because, not surprisingly, the places where the Pullman car company, which created these fancy train cars with on the southeast side, and it's also the site where there's like over the countless landfills that were unmarked, unsanctioned. There was no regulation of it at first, so people just dumped there. And so it is now officially a planned manufacturing district that the state has created these corridors that are for planned manufacturing. But all of these are in the more uh, diverse neighborhoods, the Black and Brown neighborhoods, the more economically depressed neighborhoods. And there was a fight. It's still ongoing, but there is a metal recycling company that was on the wealthier, whiter north side of Chicago that the white neighbors essentially protested and got it fined and ticketed and made it impossible for them to continue to exist there as this neighborhood became more and more gentrified. And so then they got permission to move to the southeast side, which already has a ton of heavy industry and is in this plant manufacturing district. And so residents there, while they have traditionally worked for these companies, Ford Motor Company is there, and other metal recyclers, and um, there's a port there as well. Um, but now the families of these generations that have worked for the steel companies and then the other industries, they are
Sorry,
now
losing you a bit,
protesting.
Yoshi.
Oh, okay. I see you froze.
Hello?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Technology today. Okay, there you are.
Oh,
Sorry.
there you are. Well, what I'm trying to describe is this. There's often a tension that is posited. You can either have jobs or you can have an environment. You can't have both. And so most recently, there was a huge fight of resistance on the southeast side to this metal recycler coming into their community, in spite of the fact that these are the residents who also have for generations worked in the steel companies and for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District and for the heavy industrial processes that go on there. But the cost to human health and like the rates of asthma in the children and breathing irregularities and lung related disorders um, are like the tide is turning. And I was at a meeting recently with the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency as part of the Biden Harris administration. His name is Michael Regan. He seems like a lovely guy. But it was amazing to be at this meeting with the other leaders of grassroots environmental justice organizations who were, by and large, older women of color, mothers, daughters, just women in the community. And I'm wondering if the transformation of the chemical park from this, you know, really explicitly like dumping mercury into the water, it's like sounds insane. Um, but these government entities that are now privatized, um, is there is there still this tension that you see between like you can have a cleaner environment but it will cost you, or you can have leisure and and it's just for the rich and you have your nice leisure, beautiful green space, or you have like an industrial town and you have the jobs and you have the wages but you will pay for it with the quality of the air and the water and your health. Is that a relevant conversation, do you think, in the for
Yeah, I think
Bitterfeld?
it's interesting to see this sort of the environmental justice discourse of the states, and like you say, sort of which bodies are bearing the burdens, which is very I think explicitly kind of played out in the states. The kind of the history around Bitterfeld, I think it's very tied to jobs. It's very tied to labor and kind of labor and industry. But I think what happened in that break was it's like one person was working at one factory under one certain regime, and and then all of a sudden everything was sort of reformulated, but it's the same person having to work. I mean, it's there has been no move, so to say. It's just been like a transformation of the place. But I mean, that said, with this big kind of development of the chemical industry, of course, it now attracts another kind of labor force. I mean, during socialist time, everyone was kind of involved in the chemical industry in the region, and now it has kind of specialized in another type of industry. Like it's really there are X amount of jobs for the sort of hard labor there, running the the like brown collar, blue collar jobs, but they're not at all in relation. So unemployment is other than it was. I mean, there was no unemployment in GDR time. You were just kind of in different activities. So that's something that was like created when the wall came down. It was like all of a sudden you're unemployed, like you do not have labor. So I think those two different histories, or like the kind of legacies around these two places are play out different, but I think they still have this sort of precarity, or this kind of whose life matters, and how do you make it matter. I think that's still very played out, but it doesn't maybe perhaps play out in a kind of racialized, but definitely in a class.
Yes,
Yeah. So
completely. Yeah. Okay. That in
one thing that I also find, because you said it, this kind of the moving of something away from, as soon as a certain area becomes, wealthy enough to say, like, we don't want it. I mean, that's the sort of hook that got me into this, the dynamics between East and West Germany, or that tension, that is sort of historical tension and relationship that was kind of constituted between them. Because, for example, I did a project with an environmental historian, Jonas Stuck, and visual artist Jonas Stahl, kind of dealing with the toxic waste externalization from West Berlin to literally like 30 kilometers west of it. Because, within a sort of border, or like a boundary, made up boundary, the people inside said, like, we do not want our, bad waste here. And so, due to kind of a precarious, unjust relation, that waste and those burdens were simply like put on top of someone else. So for me, it was very, and then what I think is becomes the extra twist when you look at German history is that all of a sudden that geographical border kind of dissolved, and it's just the same thing. And now they're like having to deal with it. But I mean, before they were like, well, it's just on the other side. I don't see the fence, and that's been the sort of, it's interesting which sort of mechanisms, how do you put that together, and how do you reconcile that kind of violence that was once perpetrated? Like how do you, it's still a
it's
burden that is held in people's bodies.
100%. And so, I mean, I see the same dynamic happens on the micro scale and the macro scale. And so we see like there are certain sites that are designated as accepting hazardous waste. And so if you clean up a site, say like in the neighborhood that I used to live in, Pilsen, and where one of the organizations are, they were successful in getting a brass smelter, a metal smelter, which was emitting tons of airborne lead that was getting contaminated in the air and then also contained in the soil. And it was next to a school, and all these families lived there. So they successfully got them to the Environmental Protection Agency, forced them, fined them millions of dollars, forced them to clean up. But what cleaning up actually means is that they go into all of the yards, and they dig up the first 6 inches of topsoil, and they put it in a container, and they send it to a hazardous waste facility. And that hazardous waste facility is just next door to somebody else. So it's this odd relocation of waste to like the path of least resistance or the path of class resistance. Um, and so even as Bubbly Creek is going to be beautified and the Army Corps of Engineers, it's going to be a almost $20 million cleanup effort as soon as the federal government will allocate the funding. But one of the fears is that when you make this a beautiful park or like have a lake, you know, a river walk that would be so nice to picnic or fish or bring your children, who can then afford to live there? And already like the beautiful condominiums are coming up. Um, so that dynamic that you're describing um, between, you know, state borders and what is shifted when those state borders are like taken away. I mean, it's happening on the town level, the neighborhood level, and then nationally. Like our recycling obviously is a joke because China doesn't want US plastic anymore. So yeah, they
And at the end of it, like the what I believe is this like like this reproduction of of a belief that this sort of, you know, as in the way there's no, like there's no ultimate sink and there's no space of purity, like it's and but I feel there's still like within a kind of constituting and understanding the world, we still work with these like binaries of inside outside, or you know that these kind of reproduce this toxicity constantly because it's like you say, you're just like constantly shifting it away, and then it's just about kind of a value scale. I mean, we can also talk about like non-human bodies, you know, like there
sure.
are animal bodies and plant bodies, and you know, how do we kind of value their burdens and loads, and kind of these kind of bigger relations and responsibilities that emanate. So it's a that's why I find, you know, when you talk about a kind of remediation, it also sort of points to a kind of returning to, like you want to, you know,
Right.
it's almost nostalgic in its attempt. Somehow it's bringing back these like binaries even clearer as a like nature as a representation, as many remediation schemes do. They tend to beautify, and then the question is like, so what is that? I mean, what you talk about this fish hotel, you know, that's something that is being pretty real about the situation and trying to tinker with it and like form a very healthy alliance with fish, you know,
Right.
because fish like we don't survive without different critters in the oceans doing different worlds and ecologies, you know. It's I think it's these type of remediation efforts that are true, or they're not true, of course. Like in Bitterfeld, you will have to clean water indefinitely. I mean, that's an important thing to do, but it's not solving a problem. There's so many other like reconciliations and sort of reconfigurations of being with that legacy and that kind of history that needs other kind of methods or other approaches, and it needs to be opened up, fleshed up, and
I'm curious because these issues are so large and so scalar. What are there particular thinkers or theorists, philosophers who are helpful to you in your research in sort of contextualizing or framing these conversations? I can speak for myself that in talking about these, you know, what are the stakes for various communities, the rate of violence feels like a useful way to think. Rob Nixon's conversation about slow violence has been largely incorporated into this discourse, and it also gives a way to think about I mean, not that the concept of state violence is new, but to think of offloading these responsibilities or permitting these externalities from industry, such as like having a toxic release inventory that where we give permits to companies to emit a certain tonnage of whichever toxic inventory emission they're using in their manufacturing. But the government issues permits for this. And to think of these kinds of profiteering, like private profits at public expense, as a form of state violence that we participate in, that's definitely been a helpful way for me to think about it. And then more recently, I've been reading Andreas Malm's um, how to break a pipeline, how to bomb a pipeline.
Okay, I'm not
Uh,
familiar.
he's a Marxist of human ecology at Lund University, but what he is pointing to or urging the sort of environmental justice movements to do is to take a more militant stance and to stop being so polite and to start damaging property, because we the idea of pacifism in these movements is so overriding that it's no longer effective, essentially. So I don't, these are, I'm deviating here, I'm moving around, but I
The
think
topic tends to produce that. Notice it, yeah,
but certainly
yeah.
rates of violence and timescales of violence has been helpful to me. And then using Marxist ideas, Marxist ecology, I guess, absorbing some of this from certain thinkers. I haven't bombed any pipelines yet myself, but I think about it.
No, because it's interesting that you bring it up because that's what we were talking a lot about in this workshop was this notion of commoning and, like, toxic commons as a way, as a practice of, kind of taking over commons, but also, does that include acts of resistance or does it just mean like, staying with it and kind of accepting, where do you draw these, yeah, we were having very many discussions around this, and I think I'm myself not clear. I think what I would love, or you get that you kind of approach a kind of prismatic phenomena, like you get that it's really entangled, it's really situated. There's naturally helpful thinkers that put it in bigger context, but you realize every time you come down into the nitty gritty or the actual situation and then actually translating that into a practice of doing, of being with it, of relating to it proper, it requires such a bigger toolbox and such precision. So I definitely think it needs to be included, um, but not in all cases. I think some moves are smarter than others, and I think the more interesting is like how do you build those alliances? I think that's like a constant leftish crisis that you just like not allowing things to be next to each other and be different. And we talked a lot about this, how there's many different ways of doing it, and there are also very many different worlds and different many ecologies, like to talk in the plural as a more generative, like expanding encompassing way of approaching these things. But I definitely think there's some thinkers that have been helpful to me. I'm as like within STS, science technology studies, Max Laboron's work on, and she has a book out now. I haven't read it yet, but Pollution is Colonialism. Um, and she has, yeah, I think everyone's been waiting very long for her to birth this book, so the expectations are high. But I've heard her talk about it, and I think they follow what she's been working on for a long time and understanding sort of science as a colonial, or like understanding the frame and the lens and the approach as like really having to scrutinize those and be being careful when you yourself kind of reproduce a narrative that can kind of reproduce the violence. It's tricky ground, but I think well with her. And then God, there's so many. I think there's so many great thinkers out there. But I think this topic has been like particularly, and I think she has also helped that field very much to sort of structure up in thought. So a good recommendation, I would say.
Thank you. Yes, I will definitely pursue that. Um, I was wondering if you, speaking of, how to frame and contextualize, I understand there's a festival planned for Bitterfeld, and that is like sounds like a very welcoming frame. And I just was curious if are you involved, or what are the plans, or is this a celebration? Um,
Book festival, you mean?
the festival.
Yeah. No, the festival is grappling with this legacy, and I think also grappling. It's called Osten, as it's really to understand the East and the sort of the legacy of the of Eastern Germany and that kind of bundle of, because I mean there's been a real internal, it's like two countries being merged into one country, but like one country, federal Germany, is the West, and the East were the ones that kind of failed at their project of world making. And now, that kind of remediation or that assimilation has not been, in its all its in its attempt, been doing well in it. It's left a lot of kind of toxic, it's like social toxicity also. And so I think that's what this festival is dealing with very much, and it's going to be placed or it's situated in the Kulturpalaz, which is the house of culture in Bitterfeld, which is a kind of architectural topology that evolved during socialist time as a kind of a huge building that could host all the sort of commoning, or like the culturing and cultivating of this kind of socialist subject. So it had, you did arts and crafts and different workshops, and you came from the factory and then you were kind of socialized. So this building that has been extremely uh, big and rich to so many lives in Bitterfeld now stands abandoned. When the wall came down, this, like it doesn't fit into any kind of economic logic to have like people have so much space to just like be with each other and be unproductive and uneconomical with each other. And at the same time, it's being kind of eaten from underneath by such severe groundwater contamination that it needs severe refurbishment. So this building has become a kind of relic that sits in the town as a reminder of that, like very big tensions, that those big histories and those big legacies that sort of play with each other. And this festival is kind of reappropriating, and it starts to be, it has started a very kind of substantial refurbishment now. But the idea is to sort of reprogram. So there's a lot of activity, and this is from, from the performing arts to art. And so this project is now evolving and taking shape. And there's, like it's hard to talk concretely what will
Sure.
be, but naturally the notion of toxicity, also environmental toxicity, is a thread that also weaves into this narrative there. Yeah.
It
So
sounds very wonderful and exciting.
yeah.
Um, well, I think that's a good place to maybe wind down. Um, I love book recommendations, and in addition, if you have any other, what have your favorite reads of the recent, I don't know, maybe in the pandemic, but I know you
Oh
have a
God.
family too, so
God.
um,
Yeah. Thinking about that, you break the bag now, like I was on a train, and to even get that little window to have a read, I look very much forward to. But the last book I read, which is not like a big surprise of it, but living on the arts of living on a damaged planet, which I think is a really great go-to, and it has a really nice range of thought provocations and perspectives and ways to think with. It's incredible now that I feel like I have so many, and then I don't have any thoughts at all. I mean, I'm also a very big fan of Michelle Murphy, um, who also talks very much. I mean, her book about the economization of life, but she's also written extensively on kind of chemical, the chemical burdens, and she's talked about the alter life instead of the afterlife, like to understand
Mm,
the reproduction of certain toxic relations and what these alter lives are. So that's she's really great to dig into if kind of chemistry and what chemistry does to us is something of a topic. Yeah.
that sounds great, and I really appreciate it. Anna Singh has certainly been active in the conversation, and
Yeah.
I'll check out Michelle Murphy. Um, to your point about like alter life or afterlife, we have Guillermo Garcia Perez, and he is going to speak on his essay, The Transmodal Community, on Sunday, which we'll finally have in translation. So once I have a translation, I can
I
send it
would,
off to you.
yeah, my thoughts, they linger around notions of mourning and kind of presence and absence, and because I think these legacies and kind of how we embody them or carry them with us is I think there's a lot there to dig in. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. I will tap in even though it's holiday. Yeah.
I agree. And I think that, yes, the trauma that is imposed on everyone who is living with all these legacies, like it demands grief and mourning and acknowledgement and processing. So it'll
Value.
be nice to continue these threads.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, Thank you so much for joining us. You are my bookend to the Instagram live conversations, and it's wonderful to meet with you. And I hope that I get to see you when I'm in Berlin and not too far down the road
No,
in September.
yeah, exactly. No, it's super. Thank you for having me. I'm happy that we still made it work in a kind of digital analog way here. Feeling, but a super pleasure, and thanks for having me. I'm feeling grateful. Thank you.